I thought I was just driving out to check a strange late-night carnival that appeared on a flyer with no background info. My name is Richard. I'm 31 years old, and I work as a freelance brand designer based in Porto, Portugal. Most of my work is remote, which means long hours alone in front of a screen, handling revisions, client calls, and constant digital deadlines. Because of that, I usually take night drives when I need to reset my head after finishing a project. Nothing unusual, just quiet roads outside the city and time away from work noise. This happened after I finished a large branding job that had taken me almost 2 weeks to complete. I remember sitting at my desk late at night when I noticed a flyer slipped under my apartment door. There was no envelope, no delivery stamp, and no indication of who left it. It only contained an address, the name Vale Carnival, and a short line that read, "Opens late. No queues." I don't usually pay attention to things like that, but the absence of any branding or online presence made it feel unusual. I checked for it online anyway and found nothing. No listings, no social media, no event announcements. That should have been the end of it, but instead it made me more curious than cautious. Around 11 p.m., I decided to drive out just to see what it was. The location was outside Porto, in an area I wasn't familiar with, closer to older rural roads that don't get much traffic at night. My GPS initially recognized the route, but the closer I got, the less accurate it became. Eventually, it stopped updating properly, so I had to rely on the road signs and instinct. The drive took me deeper into isolated terrain than I expected. Streetlights disappeared, and the road became narrow with thick tree lines on both sides. There was no signal at all on my phone by the time I reached the final stretch. I remember thinking I should probably turn back, but at that point, I was already close enough to continue. Then the forest suddenly opened into a wide gravel area that wasn't marked on any map I had seen. Surprisingly, the carnival had already started. Everything from the lighting systems to the rides in motion. The Ferris wheel was rotating slowly, and smaller attractions were running through cycles as if they were being tested or maintained automatically. The most noticeable detail was the absence of people. There were no lines, no staff members, and no visible visitors anywhere in the area. At first, I stayed in my car for a few minutes just observing. Nothing suggested urgency or emergency, but nothing about it felt normal either. The entire place functioned without human presence, which made it difficult to interpret what I was looking at. Eventually, I checked my phone again and saw the time was 11:58 p.m. At the entrance gate, there was a wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Lunavale, last entry, 12 a.m. I remember focusing on that line longer than I expected to, because it felt less like a welcome message and more like a condition. I can't clearly explain why I got out of the car, but I did. I left the engine running and walked toward the entrance. The moment I crossed the gate, I noticed how different the air felt compared to outside. It wasn't colder or warmer, just noticeably still, like sound didn't travel the same way anymore. The ground was clean, almost unnaturally maintained, with no visible footprints despite how active everything appeared. Rides continued operating in slow cycles without interruption, and lights across the carnival moved in synchronized patterns that felt programmed rather than managed. I told myself it was likely some kind of automated installation or closed testing site, but that explanation didn't hold for long. As I walked deeper into the carnival, I started noticing mirrors placed throughout the space. They weren't decorative in the usual sense. They were positioned along walkways, between booths, and near ride entrances in a way that didn't seem random. At first, I assumed they were part of the design, but I began avoiding them after I noticed something off. My reflection didn't behave consistently. Sometimes it lagged behind my movement slightly, and other times it reacted before I did. I stopped once to test it, and my reflection didn't stop at the same time. It took one additional step forward before pausing on its own. That was the first moment I started feeling uncomfortable, because it didn't match anything I could logically explain. Shortly after that, I heard a voice. It didn't come from any visible speaker or location I could identify. It was clear, neutral, and evenly projected across the space, as if it wasn't tied to direction at all. It said, "You have arrived early." There was no tone suggesting urgency or emotion, just a statement of timing. I looked around for a source, but there was nothing visible that could have produced it. A few seconds later, the same voice continued, saying, "All attractions are prepared." That was when I turned back toward the entrance, expecting to see the gate behind me. But it wasn't there anymore. Where the entrance had been was now a large tent structure I hadn't noticed before. It was darker than the rest of the carnival, and the material didn't reflect light the same way. I remember standing still for a moment, trying to recall whether I had passed it earlier, but I couldn't place it in my memory at all. Eventually, I approached it and stepped inside. The interior was different from the rest of the carnival. It was quieter, with reduced lighting and no visible machinery or ride components. Inside, there were rows of seats arranged in a circular pattern facing inward. At first, I thought it might be some kind of waiting area or staff staging zone, but there were no instructions or equipment indicating that. Every seat was already occupied. I immediately stepped back and exited the tent. The moment I did, the carnival lights flickered once across the entire area before returning to normal. Everything resumed its movement as if no interruption had occurred. There were no changes in sound, motion, or activity. From an external perspective, nothing appeared altered at all. I eventually left the carnival area through a different route that connected back to the main road, much farther than where I had originally parked. My car was still there, untouched, with the engine off. The GPS signal returned only after I reached the highway again. I still can't explain what the place was or why it felt eerie. I've checked the location multiple times since then, but I've never been able to find the exact spot again. Most of the time I tell myself it was a misidentified private setup or some kind of temporary installation that I misunderstood. That explanation helps, at least logically. But I still avoid driving that far out at night now, especially when there are unmarked roads involved. I was working security for a traveling carnival setup when two visitors were briefly seen near the perimeter fence. Nothing about that seemed unusual at first, until hours later when a locked storage trailer triggered a missing persons call that no one at the site had ever received. I'm 34 years old, and I've worked security for mobile event operations for most of my adult life. It's not a fixed job site, which means we move with the client from location to location, usually setting up in large parking lots outside malls or stadiums before opening to the public. Most of the work is routine: perimeter checks, trailer inspections, and monitoring equipment during setup. This happened while I was assigned to Brightwood Carnival, one of those traveling amusement setups that stay in one place for a few days before moving on. We were in the middle of a standard setup day in late spring, parked in a large shopping complex outside Lyon, France. The weather was clear, warm, and stable, which usually makes setup days easier because there's less risk of equipment delays or crowd issues. I had been with the company for several years at that point, so I knew most of the crew and regular operators by name. That kind of familiarity makes long setup shifts easier because you get used to the rhythm of things. Around mid-afternoon, I was doing my usual perimeter walk, checking fencing and making sure storage trailers were locked before we began testing rides. That was when I noticed two visitors near the outer fence line. They were both young adults, probably early 20s. One of them was recording on her phone while the other was talking and laughing as they walked along the edge of the lot. They weren't inside the fenced area, just moving parallel to it like they were filming content for social media. That kind of thing happens often around traveling carnivals, so I didn't think much of it at first. I watched them briefly to make sure they weren't trying to enter restricted areas, then continued my rounds. When I circled back roughly 20 minutes later, they were gone. No sign of them near the entrance points or surrounding walkways. I assumed they had simply left the area. Looking back, that was the first detail I should have logged more carefully. Around late afternoon, I was contacted over radio by another crew member who had been walking near the storage trailers. He mentioned hearing what sounded like movement inside one of the older cargo units. We used numbered trailers for storage, and Trailer 7 was the largest one we had on site, mainly used for spare ride parts and prize inventory. It wasn't unusual for older trailers to make shifting sounds during setup, especially when equipment was being moved nearby. Still, I walked over to check it myself. On the way there, I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt behind the trailer. 2 sets, both relatively small, like casual footwear rather than work boots. That stood out because the area behind the storage units wasn't an active work zone. There was no reason for anyone to be walking there. The chain on Trailer 7 was also loose when I arrived. I know for a fact I had checked that lock earlier that morning, and it was secured. At the time, I assumed another staff member had accessed it and forgotten to re-lock it properly. The reported noise from inside had already stopped by the time I reached the trailer. I stood outside for a moment listening, but there was nothing except ambient setup noise from the Carnival rides being tested in the distance. Eventually, I opened the trailer. Inside, everything looked like standard storage. Boxes of equipment, folded canvas panels, spare ride decorations, and maintenance tools were stacked along both sides. There was nothing visually out of place at first glance. What I did notice was the smell. It wasn't strong, but it was distinct. A mixture of old plastic, heavy cleaning solution, and a strange, stagnant dampness that didn't belong in a storage environment like that. The air also felt unusually still, like ventilation wasn't circulating properly inside the trailer. I called out to check if anyone was inside. There was no response. After a few seconds, I assumed the earlier sound must have been shifting cargo or vibration from nearby equipment testing. At that moment, I received another call over radio requesting assistance with a mechanical issue near one of the ride platforms. I closed and re-locked Trailer 7 before leaving to assist. That was the last time I checked it before opening. Around opening preparations later that evening, we began receiving standard visitor traffic flow updates and final system checks. Everything appeared normal until approximately 6:30 p.m., when I received an emergency transfer call through dispatch. The call had been routed through an external emergency system and then traced back to our location. The dispatcher reported that 2 individuals had called from within the Carnival grounds, claiming they had stepped inside a storage trailer but the heavy door had jammed and they were unable to open it from the inside. According to the transcript summary I was given, the call was unstable and partially cut off, but both voices sounded distressed and whispered about someone outside the trailer moving nearby. The call ended abruptly before additional details could be confirmed. When I heard the trailer number mentioned in the report, I immediately understood they were referring to Trailer 7. I went there immediately. When I arrived, I removed the chain and opened the trailer fully. There was no hesitation at that point, because the situation had escalated into a possible safety incident. I announced my presence and stepped inside while calling out for anyone who might be there. Inside, the trailer looked largely unchanged from earlier. However, further in toward the center aisle, I found a phone case lying on the floor between stacked boxes. It was personal, decorated with small stickers, and clearly not part of any equipment inventory. Near it were visible marks on the floor surface, light scratches and scuffs that suggested the heavy inventory boxes had been hastily rearranged to create a hiding space. The smell inside the trailer was slightly stronger now, but still not identifiable as anything specific to equipment or materials we used. There were no people inside. I checked the back section of the trailer, but all storage containers were intact. Eventually, I found a small silver keychain shaped like a ticket stub behind a stack of ride components, partially wedged between boxes. At that point, I exited and reported the situation immediately. Emergency services were contacted and arrived on site shortly after. The area was secured, and all Carnival operations were paused. I gave my statement multiple times as part of standard procedure, walking through the timeline of what I had observed earlier in the day and what I found upon re-entry. A full inspection of Trailer 7 was conducted afterward. No additional individuals were found inside. However, investigators documented the phone case, the markings on the floor, and signs of recent movement within the trailer space that did not match operational activity. The most confusing part of the review was the discrepancy between the emergency call log and physical evidence. The call existed in the system, but there was no confirmed entry point into the trailer that would explain how anyone could have remained inside undetected during the earlier inspection window. The Carnival was shut down that night pending review. All trailers were inspected, and all ride systems were temporarily disabled. Nothing further was found during the initial search phase. I left the company shortly after the incident was resolved. Even now, I still work in event security, just not with mobile Carnival setups. Most environments feel normal again once you step away from situations like that. But every now and then, when I'm assigned to large storage facilities or temporary event sites, I still check access points more carefully than I need to, because I've learned that most systems only work properly when nothing unexpected is inside them, and sometimes the absence of confirmation is the only thing that feels wrong enough to notice. We didn't notice him during the entire night. Not once. Not while we were there. Not while we were taking photos. Not even when we were standing less than a few meters from where he apparently was. We only found him the next morning because of something simple. A timestamp mismatch on Clara's phone. One of the images from the night market showed a figure standing behind us that neither of us could explain, because according to every memory we had of that moment, nobody else was there. That night at the Riverside night market started like any other closing shift. Clara and I were both in our early 20s, working temporary stalls along the waterfront setup that rotated between different towns every few weeks. It was never a permanent job, just seasonal work with long hours, noisy crowds, and nights that always ended too late. Clara was assigned to a small game booth that evening, one of those bottle toss setups with cheap prizes and plastic counters that never stayed clean for long. I had finished my shift at a food stall earlier, but I stuck around to help her pack up. By the time most customers left, the place had already shifted into cleanup mode, with vendors folding tarps and dragging crates back into storage trucks. The atmosphere changed quickly once the crowd disappeared. The music shut off in sections, leaving only distant generator hums and the sound of wheels rolling over gravel. The lights stayed on, but they didn't feel as bright anymore. Everything looked slightly worn down, like the night was no longer performing for anyone. We were talking casually while cleaning Clara's booth. Nothing important. Jokes about broken prizes, complaints about sore feet, the usual end-of-night nonsense. She kept tossing soft rubber ducks at me whenever I slowed down, and I kept stacking plush toys just to knock them over again. It was stupid, repetitive work, but it made the time pass faster. When we finally finished, neither of us felt like leaving immediately. The whole market still had that half-open feeling, like the night wasn't fully over yet. Some stalls were still lit, others already completely dark, creating uneven patches of brightness across the lot. That's when we noticed the mirror tent. It was tucked between two storage trailers near the edge of the setup, partially hidden behind stacked crates. The entrance flap was hanging loose, secured only by a light chain that wasn't actually locked. Clara mentioned she had never gone inside it during the week it was open to the public. We didn't think much of it. It was just another attraction that had already been packed up. We went inside anyway. The moment we stepped in, the temperature felt slightly off. Not cold or hot, just still. Like the air wasn't moving properly. There was a single overhead emergency light flickering at uneven intervals, making the room seem more uncomfortable than usual. We stayed for a few minutes, laughing at how the light was probably set up this way on purpose. Clara took a couple of photos with her phone while we moved around. Then we left, because the air inside started to feel uncomfortable. After that, we didn't think much about the whole thing again. We went back to Clara's booth to grab her bag and finish closing. The rest of the market was even quieter now. Most vendors were gone, and only a few maintenance workers were still moving around in the distance, loading equipment into trucks. We started taking more photos on her phone. Not planned shots, just random ones of the empty stalls and dim lights. Clara even posed on the edge of her counter, pretending to sell invisible prizes, and I took a few pictures just to mess with her later. At the time, nothing felt unusual. We were just two people who had finished a normal shift in an almost empty venue. We didn't notice anything until the next morning. We were at Clara's apartment, sitting at her kitchen table eating cereal and scrolling through the photos from the night before. It was casual at first. We were laughing at blurry shots, awkward angles, and bad lighting. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then Clara stopped on one image. It was a photo of me standing near the plush shelf behind her booth. The image itself wasn't strange at first glance. The lighting was dim, slightly grainy, just like most of the others. But behind me, partially obscured between the booth structure and a storage trailer, there was a person. At first, we thought it might be a shadow or some piece of equipment, but when we zoomed in, it became clearer that it was a man standing still in the background, not interacting, not posing, just positioned in a way that suggested he was trying not to be noticed. What made it worse wasn't his appearance, it was how unnoticed he had been at the time. Neither of us remembered seeing anyone there. We went back through the photos. He appeared again in another frame, slightly closer. Then again in a third, now positioned closer to the edge of the booth area. In each image, he seemed to be present for a moment before disappearing into angles that neither of us had consciously registered while we were taking the pictures. He didn't look like he was approaching us. He didn't look aggressive. He looked deliberate, like someone moving through an environment while trying to remain outside attention rather than part of it. Clara went quiet after that. She stopped scrolling and set her phone down on the table. I tried to rationalize it, suggesting it might have been another worker finishing up late or someone passing through the setup area. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. We decided to go back to the night market site that afternoon just to ask if anyone recognized him or had seen someone lingering after closing. Most of the stalls were already being dismantled, and the atmosphere had completely shifted from lively to mechanical. We showed the images to one of the site supervisors. He looked through them carefully, but didn't immediately respond. After a long pause, he took the phone and walked toward the security trailer near the entrance. A few minutes later, he returned with someone else from the management team. They pulled up the night footage from the perimeter cameras. That's when the situation stopped feeling like a misunderstanding. The footage showed sections of the night where the man was clearly visible, moving between stalls after most of the crowd had left. He didn't run or hide quickly. Instead, he moved in short, controlled steps, always staying near objects that blocked direct view from the cameras. He never stayed in one place too long, never crossed open spaces unless the cameras had already shifted angle. It looked less like random wandering and more like someone navigating based on awareness of observation points. He also occasionally paused as if listening for movement before continuing in a new direction. What unsettled me most was how close he got to Clara's booth without ever being clearly seen by either of us while we were there. The cameras showed him standing just behind the mirror tent entrance while we were inside it, but we never noticed him. He had been standing near the entrance long enough to suggest he was aware of our presence before moving away. The management team said they would increase checks and review footage from other nights, but there was no immediate explanation. No missing person report matched him, no staff recognized him, no vendors recalled anyone fitting that description. After a week, everything just stopped being discussed. Even the tone of conversation changed whenever the topic came up. The market packed up and moved to the next location as scheduled. Clara deleted most of the photos. She said she didn't want to keep looking at something that didn't make sense. I kept one image not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't fully convince myself it meant nothing. Every time I walk through a quiet outdoor setup at night, empty stalls, half-packed trailers, lights still humming after everyone leaves, I find myself scanning the space first, because that's where he always was. If you enjoyed tonight's stories, don't just disappear into the dark like nothing happened. Hit subscribe to stay part of the Deep Horror channel, because here, the stories don't end when the video does. They linger. They follow you back into the quiet moments when everything should feel normal, but doesn't quite.